Okay, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What Is True. I'll play a little bit of pre-music here by a band that I used to follow back in the 80s called The Fix. Stand or fall. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Either we're going to stand or we're going to fall. Okay, what I wanted to do is start from this particular book here. This book is called The Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Mr. Mullins. And Mr. Mullins has got a interesting way of looking at things. He did a lot of research. He did a lot of his research at the Library of Congress, with many books that basically that we're not able to attain sometimes. They're in what I call in rooms that are protected, so to speak. So what I'm going to read is the intro here from his book, and also chapter 1. And then we'll go on another night and we'll do another chapter, so to speak, of the different plans that were actually mapped out back in the 1900s. So this is Jefferson's opinion on the constitutionality of the bank. This was dated February 15th, 1791. So I'm going to read this to you. The writings of Thomas Jefferson. This comes from a guy named H.E. Berg, B-E-R-G-H, in volume 3. And this is page 145. And this is what he has to say about the Constitution of the bank. This is the first bank in the United States of America. The bill for establishing a national bank in 1791 undertakes, among other things, to form the subscribers into a corporation. Okay, so you see what's going on already. This is going to become a corporation here. To enable them in their corporate capacity to receive grants of land, and so far it is against the law of mortmain. To make alien subscribers capable of holding lands, and so far is against the laws of alienés. 4. To transmit their lands, and to transmit these lands on the death of a proprietor to a certain line of successors, and so far changes the course of descents. You see what's happening here. Continue on. Number 5. To put the lands out of the reach of forfeiture or escheat, and so far is against the laws of forfeiture and escheat. So he's again quoting law. To transmit personal chattels to successors in a certain line, and so far it is against the law of distribution. Number 7. to give them the sole and exclusive right of banking. This is talking about private bankers. Okay? Under the national authority, and so far as against the laws of monopoly. Number 8, to communicate to them a power to make laws paramount to the laws of the states, for so they must be construed to protect the institutions from the control of the state legislatures, and so probably they will be construed. I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid out on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it, to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. 12th Amendment. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundaries thus field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution, and they weren't. Alexander Hamilton pushed this whole idea. If Alexander Hamilton had his whole way of doing things, the United States would have become a monarch. So when I've already read this book, and I want to explain to you, this is some of the chapters, chapter 2 and 3 are going to talk about what they call and I'm not going to read that tonight, but what I wanted to share with you that there were two plans. There was the Federal Reserve Act, which was almost similar to the Aldrich plan. So there are two particular bills that are being pushed by two political parties here, okay? And this is taking place under Woodrow Wilson. And an Aldrich plan is actually the Senator Aldrich from the state of New Jersey, okay? So this is going to be started here with Jekyll Allen, and there's a key person in this whole thing about the Federal Reserve is a gentleman named Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg was a German who came to America in the early 1900s and then became a citizen of this country. And his whole idea, this is all mapped out as though it's been planned for time being. That is, he came here for a purpose. He came here for a purpose to eventually to create a bank, but it would be a private bank, and it would control all the assets of the United States government and the people. You see, the government itself at one time was producing money. That's what's called the Treasury Department. What this does is it gives a group of bankers, and it would be at that point was 6 of them, and what was contrived would eventually those would be other people would buy into that by buying what we call not bonds, but shares of the Federal Reserve Bank. Key, it's not federal, it's not a reserve bank, and it surely isn't a system. It's actually chaos. And what we're experiencing today in our own time is what's happening is that they're printing paper money, and they're printing it without stipulations. In other words, they just continue to print it and print it. When I say print it, today they don't print it all, but in reality simply is just they're producing it on the computer, so to speak. Without any gold or silver behind will lead to a catastrophe. So you're printing paper money that will become worth less. Because the more you print, it becomes worth less. And they do these things, what they call boom and bust. Boom, that goes to their paper, it goes up the stock market. And bust means it comes back down. And they make money on both ways. And they have people who are involved in this. That's why they bought into shares, such and such. And actually, Mr. Eustace Mullins goes into what I would call the key banks, mainly in New York City, that bought into the shares of this Federal Reserve, so that they would have a piece of the pie, so to speak. So let's go on here, and I'll read from this particular book here as I do this tonight. So this is on the night of November 22nd, 1910. And it would be interesting to also just for anybody that knows a lot about astrology, what was so key about this particular day? It might be something we could look at in the future. A group of newspaper reporters stood disconsolately in the railroad station at Hoboken, New Jersey. They had just watched a delegation of the nation's leading financiers leave the station on a secret mission. And let me explain what they were doing. Many of these railroads would do what we call back then, they still do it. They will allow what they call a private car at the end of the train. And sometimes those are mostly what we call passenger, can be a passenger car, but it could be a train that's going on, such and such. So what's happening simply is they're on a private car. And they're actually what I call probably the last car on, in fact, most likely would be the last car on the train itself. And this allows them to have complete privacy as they're on the rail. And this is the only way to transport in a timely manner to get somewhere. And this particular place called Jekyll Island has already been bought beforehand for rich people, but the bankers, a place where they can go during the wintertime to recreate and enjoy themselves in a warmer climate. So this is what's taking place. This has all been planned. This is not coincidence. This doesn't happen by someone just getting together and let's do something. And, Bob, let's do this, George, such and such, da-da-da. No, that's not the way it worked. So it would be years before they discover what that mission was, and even then they would not understand that the history of the United States underwent a drastic change after that night in Hoboken. The delegation had left in a sealed railroad car with blinds drawn for an undisclosed destination. They were led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, head of the National Monetary Commission. President Theodore Roosevelt had signed into law the bill creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908. So they had already begun to plan this stuff out. This is already being worked by other presidents and other senators in the past. So we're looking at, the time frame here of 1910. Okay, so this is all a plan. Franklin Roosevelt said something that nothing happens by accident. It was planned that way. That means simply is that in his time, the whole issue of the Pearl Harbor attack didn't happen by happenstance. It was planned that way, and it was. So, President Theodore had signed into law the bill creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908. So they're basically looking for a way to, quote unquote, to deal with the panic, so to speak. But this is just an excuse. Again, this is what they do. After the tragic panic of 1907, and it resulted in a public outcry that the nation's monetary system be stabilized. Aldrich had led the members of the Commission on a 2-year tour of Europe, spending some $300,000 of public money. He had not yet made a report on the results of this trip, nor had he offered any plan for banking reform. Accompanying Senator Aldrich at the Hoboken station were his private secretary, Shelton A. Andrews, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and Special Assistant to the National Monetary Commission, Frank Vanderlip, a president of National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company, and generally regarded as Morgan's personal emissary, and Charles D. Norton, president of the Morgan-dominated First National Bank of New York. Joining the group just before the train left the station was Benjamin Strong, also known as the lieutenant of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, a recent immigrant from Germany who had joined the banking house of Cum Loeb, that's Loeb, and Company in New York as a partner earning $500,000 a year. That's $500,000 back then, folks. That's a lot of money. 6 years later, a financial writer named Bertie Charles Forbes, who later founded the Forbes magazine, the present editor of Malcolm Forbes, in it to his son, wrote, "Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness. stealthily hiring hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week, under such rigid secrecy that the names of not one of them was once mentioned, lest the servants learned their identity and disclosed to the world this strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finances. I am not romancing, I am giving to the world for the first time the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report, the foundation of our new currency system, was written. The utmost secrecy was enjoined upon all. The public must not glean a hint of what was to be done. Senator Aldrich notified each one to go quietly into a private car in which the railroad had received orders to draw up on an unfrequented platform. Off the party set, New York Ulysses reporters had been told. Next one, Aldrich had confided to Henry, Frank, Paul, and Piatt that he was to keep them locked up at Jekyll Island out of the rest of the world until they had evolved and compiled a scientifically currency system for the United States. The real birth of the present Federal Reserve System, the plan done on Jekyll Island in the conference with Paul, Frank, and Henry Warburg, is the link that binds the Aldrich system and the present system together. He more than any one man had made the system possible on a working reality. The official biography of Senator Nelson Aldrich states, in the autumn of 1910, 6 men went out to shoot ducks: Aldrich, his secretary Shelton, Andrews, Davison, Van Lith, and Warburg. Reporters were waiting at the Brunswick, Georgia station. Mr. Davison went out and talked to them. The reporters dispersed, and the secret of the strange journey was not divulged. In other words, it was never shared, even though they knew something themselves, even though they were finding out something, they didn't reveal anything. Mr. Aldrich asked him how he had managed it, and he did not volunteer the information. Davison had an excellent reputation on the person who could calculate warring factions, a role he had performed for J.P. Morgan during the settling of the money panic of 1907. Another Morgan partner, T.W. Lamont, said Henry P. Davison served as arbitrary of the Jekyll Island expedition. From these references, it is possible to piece together the story of Aldrich's private car, which had left Hoboken Station with its shades down, had taken the financiers to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Some years earlier, a very exclusive group of millionaires led by J.P. Morgan had purchased the island as a winter retreat. They called themselves the Jekyll Island Hunt Club, and at first the island was used only for hunting expeditions until the millionaires realized that its pleasant climate offered a warm retreat from the ridges of winter in New York, and began to build splendid mansions which they called cottages for their family winter vacations. The club building itself, being quite isolated, was sometimes in demand for stag parties and other pursuits unrelated to hunting. On such occasions, the club members who were not invited to these specific outings were asked not to appear there for a certain number of days. Before Nelson Aldrich's party had left New York, the club members had been notified that the club would be occupied for the next 2 weeks. The Jekyll Island Club was chosen as the place to draft a plan for control of the money and credit of the people of the United States, not only because of its isolation, but also because it was the private preserve of the people who were drafting the plan. The New York Times later noted on May 3, 1931, in commenting on the death of George F. Baker, one of the J.P. Morgan's closest associates, that Jekyll Island Club had lost one of its most distinguishing members. 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by the members of Jekyll Island Club. Membership was by inheritance only. So this is 1/6 of the world's money trust. The Aldrich Group had no interest in hunting, for sure. Jekyll Island was chosen for the site of preparation of the central bank because it offered complete privacy and because there was not a journalist within 50 miles. Such was the need for secrecy that the members of the party agreed, before arriving at Jekyll Island, that no last names would be used at any time during their 2 week stay. The group later referred to themselves as the First Name Club, as the last name of Warburg, Strong, and Vanderlip, and the others were prohibited during their stay. The customary attendants had been given 2-week vacations from the club, and youth servants brought in from the mainland for this occasion who did not know the names of any of those present. So those that had worked there before, we knew maybe know 2 or 3 of these people. And then they would realize, wait a minute, I know this guy. What are you doing here? See? Even if they had been interrogated after the Aldrich plan went back to New York, they could not have given the names. This arrangement proved to be so satisfactory that the members, limited to those who had actually been present at Jekyll Island, later had a number of informal get-togethers in New York. Why all the secrecy? Why did this 1,000-mile trip in a closed railway car to a remote hunting club? Ostensibly, it was to carry out a program of public service to prepare banking reform, which would be a boon to the people of the United States, which had been ordered by the National Monetary Commission. The participants were no stranger to public beneficiaries. Unusually, their name was inscribed on brass plates or on the exterior of buildings which they had donated. This was not the procedure which they followed at Jekyll Island. No brass plates were ever erected to mark the selfless action of those who met at the private hunt club in 1910 to improve the lot of every citizen of the United States. In fact, no benefactor took place at Jekyll Island. The Aldrich Group journeyed there in private to write the banking and currency legislation which the National Monetary Commission had been ordered to prepare for the public. And at stake was the future control of the money and credit of the United States. If any genuine monetary reform had been prepared and presented to Congress, it would have ended the power of the elitist one world money creations. Jekyll Island ensured that a central bank would be established in the United States, which would give these bankers everything they have always wanted. As the most technical proficiency of those present was Paul Warburg, was charged with doing most of the drafting of the plan. His work would then be discussed and gone over by the rest of the group. Senator Nelson Aldrich was there to see that the completed plan would come out in a form which he could get passed by Congress. And the other bankers were there to include whatever details would be needed to be certain that they got everything they wanted in a finished draft composed during a one-time stay. After they returned to New York, there could be no second get-together to rework the plan. So it had to work out completely the way they wanted it to work out. They could not hope to attain such secrecy for their work on the second journey, obviously, because someone might spot them. Once was, one time getting away with it, may not get away with it the second time. The Jekyll Island group remained at the club for 9 days, working fiercely to complete their task. Despite the common interests of those present, the work did not proceed without friction. Senator Aldrich, always a domineering person, considered himself the chosen leader of the group and could not help ordering everyone else about. Aldrich also felt somewhat out of place as the only member who was not a professional banker. He had his substantial banking interests throughout his career. He had substantial banking interests throughout his career, but only as a person who profited from his ownership of bank stock. He knew little about the technical aspects of financial operations. His opposite number, Paul Warburg, believed that every question raised by the group demanded not merely an answer, but a lecture. He rarely lost the opportunity to give the members a long-distance design to impress them with the extent of his knowledge of banking. This was resented by the others, and others drew barbed remarks from Aldrich. The natural diplomacy of Henry P. Davidson proved to be the catalyst which kept them at the work. Warburg's thick alien accent grated on them and constantly reminded them that they had to accept his presence if a central bank plan was to be devised which would guarantee them their future profits. Warburg made little effort to smooth over their prejudices and contested them on every possible occasion on technical banking questions which he considered his private preserve. In all conspiracies there must be great secrecy. This is a quote from Clarence Clarendon history of rehab. The monetary reform plan prepared at Jekyll Island was to be presented to Congress as the complete work of the National Monetary Commission. It was imperative that the real authors of the bill remain hidden. So great was popular resentment against bankers since the Panic of 1907 that no congressman would dare to vote for a bill bearing the Wall Street taint, no matter who had contributed to his campaign expenses. The Jekyll Island plan was a central bank plan. And in this country, there was a long tradition of struggle against inflicting a central bank on the American people. It had begun with Thomas Jefferson's fight against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the first bank in the United States, backed by James Rothschild. It had continued with President Andrew Jackson's successful war against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the second bank in the United States, in which Nicholas Biddle, Biddle, was acting as the agent for James Rothschild of Paris. The result of that struggle was the creation of the independent sub-treasury system, which supposedly has served to keep the funds of the United States out of the hands of the financiers. A study of the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 indicate that those panics were the result of international bankers' operation in London. Remember, London is the financial center of the world, still is today. The public was demanding in 1908 that Congress enact legislation to prevent the recurrence of artificial induced money panics. Such monetary reform now seemed inedible. It was to head off and control such reform of the National Monetary Commission had been set up by Mr. Aldrich from New Jersey, since he was the majority leader of the Senate. The main problem, as Paul Warburg informed his colleagues, was to avoid the name central bank. For that reason, he decided upon the designation of Federal Reserve System. This would deceive the people into thinking it was not a central bank. However, the Jekyll Island plan would be a central bank plan, fulfilling the main functions of a central bank. It would be owned by private individuals who would profit from the ownership of shares. As a bank of issue, it would control the nation's money and credit. In the chapter of Jekyll Island in the biography of Aldrich, Stevens writes of this conference. How was the Reserve Bank to be controlled? It must be controlled by Congress. The government was to be represented in the board of directors. It was to have full knowledge of all the bank affairs. But a majority of the directors were to be chosen, directly or indirectly, by the banks of the association. Thus, the proposed Federal Reserve Bank was to be controlled by Congress and answerable to the government. But the majority of the directors were to be chosen, directly or indirectly, by the banks of the association. In the final refinements of Warburg's plan, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors would be appointed by the President of the United States, but the real work of the board would be controlled by a Federal Advisor Council, meeting with the governors. The council would be chosen by the directors of the 12 Federal Reserve banks and would remain unknown to the Republic. The next consideration was to conceal the fact that the proposed Federal Reserve System would be dominated by the masters of New York money markets. The congressmen from the South and the West could not survive if they voted for a Wall Street plan. In other words, they couldn't be elected. People had already got a sour taste in their mouth because of bankers. Farmers and small businesses in these areas had suffered most from the money panics. There had been great popular resentment against the Eastern banks, which during the 19th century became a political movement known as populism. The private papers of Nicholas Biddle, not released until more than a century after his death, show that quite early on the Eastern bankers were fully aware of the widespread public opposition to them. Paul Warburg advanced at Jekyll Island the primary deception which would prevent the citizens from recognition that his plan set up a central bank. This was the regional reserve system. He proposed a system of 4, later 12 branch reserve banks located in different sections of the country. You people outside the banking world would realize that the existing concentration of the nation's money and credit structure in New York made the proposal of a regional service reserve system a delusion. In other words, they created these 12 banks, and so they have some type of power, when in reality, they didn't have any power. It was still at the top. So in other words, it was still what I would call control with the banks. That is, the banks who actually had the shares that were in New York City. So in reality, simply is it was just a figment of such and such of being the Federal Reserve Bank in these 12 regional places. You see, they're located here in the United States. It's interesting they chose these 12. It's interesting the number 12 here also. But anyway, we'll keep on going. So here we go. Another proposal advanced by Paul was the manner of selection of administrators for the proposed regional reserve system. Again, they're going to be clever here. Senator Nelson Aldrich had insisted that the officials should be appointed, not elected, and that Congress should have no role in their selection. His Capitol Hill experience had taught him that congressional opinion would often be inimical to the Wall Street interests, as congressmen from the West side might wish to demonstrate to their constituents that they were protecting them against Eastern banks. Warburg responded that the administrators of the proposed central banks should be subject to executive approval by the president. This patent removal of the system from congressional control meant that the Federal Reserve proposal was unconstitutional from its inception. It was. It bypassed them. And they went along with it anyway. Because the Federal Reserve System was to be a bank of issue. Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5 of the Constitution expressly charges Congress with the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Warburg's plan would deprive Congress of its sovereignty, and the systems of checks and balances of power set up by Thomas Jefferson in the Constitution would now be destroyed. Administrators of the proposed system would control the nation's money and credit, and would themselves be approved by the executive department of the government, which meant one man. The judicial department, the Supreme Court, etc., was already virtually controlled by the executive department through presidential appointments to the bench. Paul Warburg later wrote a massive exposition of his plan, the Federal Reserve System, its origins and growth, of some 1,750 pages. This guy's that's a book and a half. But the name Jekyll Allen appears nowhere in the text. He does state in Volume 1, page 58, in November 1910, I was invited to join a small group of men who, at Senator Aldrich's request, were to take part in our several days conference with him to discuss the form that the new banking bill should take. During this conference, I had my first opportunity of studying the senator carefully, and I was deeply impressed by the earnest devotion with which he approached the subject, untiring patience with which he applied himself to it. It is noteworthy that Warburg does not disclose who attended this conference or where it took place, even though it was a momentous gathering which would decide the future control of the money and credit of people in the United States. He continues at page 59. But then the conference closed after a week of earnest deliberation. The rough draft of what later became the Aldrich bill had been agreed upon, and a plan had been outlined which provided for a National Reserve Association, meaning a central reserve organization with a elastic note issued based on gold and commercial paper. On page 60, Warburg writes, the results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. He adds in a footnote, though 18 years have since gone by, I do not feel free to give a description of this most interesting conference concerning with Senator Aldrich pledged all participants to secrecy. According to B.C. Forbes, revelation of the secret expedition to Jekyll Island has had surprisingly little impact. It did not appear in print until 2 years after the Federal Reserve Act had been passed by Congress. Hence, it was never read during the period when it could have had in effect. That is, during the congressional debate on the bill, Forbes' story was also dismissed by those in the know as preposterous and a mere invention. Stevenson mentions that in page 484 of his bill about Aldrich. This curious episode of Jekyll Island has been generally regarded as a myth. B.C. Forbes got some information from one of the reporters. It told in vague outline the Jekyll Island story, but made no impression and was generally regarded as a mere yarn. The cover-up of the Jekyll Island conference proceeded along two lines, both of which were successful. The first was, as Stevenson mentioned, was to dismiss the entire story as a romantic concoction which never actually took place. Although there were brief references to Jekyll Island in later books concerning the Federal Reserve Act system, these also attracted little public attention. As we have noted, Warburg's massive and supposedly definite work on Federal Reserve System does not mention Jekyll Island at all. Although he does admit that a conference took place, in none of his voluminous speeches or writings do the words Jekyll Island appear, with a single notation exception. He agreed to Professor Stevenson's request that he prepare a brief statement for Aldrich's biography. This appeared on page 485 as part of the Warburg Memorandum. In this excerpt, Warburg writes, the matter of uniform discount was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. Another member of the First Name Club was less resilient. Frank Vanderbilt later published a few brief references to the conference in the Saturday Evening Post on February 9, 1935. Now notice that these publications took place over 20 years after it had already been passed. It became law. Despite my views about the value to society of great publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was indeed a practical at any conspirator, since it would have been fatal to Senator Aldrich's plan to have it known that he was calling on anybody from Wall Street to help him in preparing his bill. Precautions were taken that would have delighted the hearts of James Stillman, a colorful and secretive banker who was president of the National City Bank during the Spanish-American War, and who was thought to have been involved in getting us into that war. I do not feel it is an exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. In a travel feature of the Washington Post, March 27, 1983, Follow the Rich to Jekyll Island, Roy Hoopes, Hoopes, states, in 1910, when Aldrich and four financial experts wanted a place to meet in secret to reform the country's banking system, they faked a hunting trip to Jekyll and for 10 days holed up at the clubhouse, where they made plans for what eventually would become the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is 1983. This is over 70 years later. Vanderlip later wrote in his autobiography, From Farm Boy to Financier, our secret expedition to Jekyll Island was the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. The essential points of the Aldrich plan were all contained in the Federal Reserve Act as it was passed. Professor E.R.A. Seliman, spelled Seligiman, a member of the international banking family of J. and W. Seliman, and head of the Department of Economics at Columbia University, wrote in an essay published by the Academy of Political Science proceeding in Volume 4, Number 4, pages 387 to 90. It is known to a very few how great is the indebtedness of the United States to Mr. Warburg. For it may be said without fear of contradiction that it fundamentally features the Federal Reserve Act is the work of Mr. Warburg more than any other man in the country. The existence of a Federal Reserve Board creates, in everything but in name, a real central bank. In the two fundamentals of command, of reserve, and of a discount policy, the Federal Reserve Act had frankly accepted the principles of the Aldrich Bill, and these principles, as has been stated, were the creation of Mr. Warburg and Mr. Warburg alone. It must not be forgotten that Mr. Warburg had a practical object in view in formulating his plans and in advancing in them slightly varying suggestions from time to time. It was incumbent on him to remember that the education of the country must be gradual, and that a large part of this task was to break down prejudice and remove suspicion. His plan, therefore, contained all sorts of elaborate suggestions designed to guard the public against fancy dangers and to persuade the country that the general scheme was at all practicable. It was the hope of Mr. Warburg that with the lapse of time it might be possible to eliminate from the law a few clauses which were inserted largely at his suggestion for educational purposes. Now that the public debt of the United States has passed $1 trillion, and remember this book's way, probably in the 80s is what I'm saying. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. The publication was 1993. May I indeed admit how great is the indebtedness of the United States to Mr. Warburg. At the time he wrote the Federal Reserve Act, the public debt was almost non-existent. Professor Lillian points out Warburg's remarkable presence that the real task of the members of the Jekyll Island Conference was to prepare a banking plan which would gradually educate the country and break down prejudices and remove suspicion. The campaign to enact the plan into law succeeded in doing just that. So that's chapter 1. This book I read let's see, what's his name? D.W. Griffith's book, which talks about Jekyll Island. But this book is more concise and to the point. And this book actually, I think, was written before Griffith's works, D.W. Griffith's work. I do have that here also. But Mr. Eustace Mullins really did a lot of detailed work in this. And obviously he had to go into a lot of things here at the Library of Congress. This is where he got some of these details here already. And he had that prerogative to do that until certain people stopped him. Ezra Pound wanted him to do this, to do the research. It's interesting that Eustace Mullins himself had enormous, Ezra Pound had enormous impact upon Eustace Mullins. And we'll maybe one day read some things about Ezra Pound. I wanted to point out that Ezra Pound knew 6 languages. He could speak those 6 languages. And I assume that would be English, French, Italian. I'm suspecting probably German, and he had also messed with Chinese. That's just 5. I don't know what the 6th one is. I'm guessing it's German, but I know that he actually did know Chinese because a lot of his poetry was brought in by him reading some certain things in Chinese and being able to put that in English. Ezra Pound is enormous. I don't want to go off the tangent here, but I want to explain Ezra Pound is probably one of the greatest poets of all time, period. A man was gifted in many areas. And like I said earlier, he never received any Nobel Prize because basically he was trying to keep his country out of World War II. With the success of this taking place, most people are unaware that this allowed the United States to now enter the First World War. There would probably not have been a World War I if the United States had not passed this at all. Because they created money out of nothing. And then what they did was simply they were able to do that in order for us to build an army, to have supplies, all these things of that nature, and also to be able to compensate those who were in other lands. In other words, the British, the French, the Germans had no money actually to fight this war. But with this taking place, it allowed that this bank here in the United States now would be using the credit of the people to create paper money. And so what that meant simply is there was a war. There would not have been a war without the bank, the Federal Reserve System. This is critical for people to understand. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson said that we're not going to war. He promised that. It was one of the biggest stigmas about his whole election. You had to also look into the political aspects of what's going on with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is, when he runs for office, he's a nobody. No one knows who he is as he campaigns as president. Only a few years before, he was the president of Princeton University. And then later, after that, he resigned and became the governor of New Jersey. And he did not serve his 4 years at governor. He was chosen to be their mark man. And then, as we look at this, there are these certain bankers, these groups of what we call, handed out what we call, in New York City, push certain candidates. And it's interesting that there are 3 candidates on the presidency opportunity. In other words, there were 3 candidates running for the same office. And Taft was the incumbent, and he was the Republican, T-A-F-T. Most people felt he would win the election. But there was a guy entering the race called Theodore Roosevelt, who had actually been president before, early 1900s. And he ran again on the Bull Moose Party. And there would have not have been a Bull Moose Party because there was money funneled into the campaign to help him run for office. He took the votes from Taft. That was the whole idea. And allowed the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, to win. And the interesting thing that takes place here is Taft was soundly defeated. It was over almost 400 delegates, not delegates, I'm sorry, the electors, Electoral College. Over 400 of those went to Woodrow Wilson, up to 535 necessary to win. It was a blowout. And Theodore Roosevelt got probably 80 of them, and less than 10 or 12 went actually for Taft, the incumbent. So people need to, connect the dots, so to speak. Why did these things happen? What purpose it? Why were they doing these things? And then you have to ask the question simply is, why did we go to war? It's nonsense when you think about it. That there's the Lusitania was bombed. In fact, the Germans warned it, and the munitions were in the armaments were in the ship. They were shipping that, so it would be an easy way of it exploding. You see, to create a provocative type of action. The whole idea was simply to remember the Maine, the battleship Maine, when it exploded near the port of Havana, Cuba. Why did that happen for? It had to be a provocation to take place in order to get people involved. Well, guess what? That created a war. That created the Spanish Civil War, Spanish-American War. And so what happened was then, this was all planned. This is what people don't understand. This was all done to create that in the Spanish-American War, to take possession not only of Cuba at that point, but also the Philippines, Manila. To also that there were already naval vessels near the Philippines to take over their Spanish colony, the Philippines. Things don't happen by coincidence here, folks. This just doesn't work. This was all a plan. That is before all this stuff. So this is the 1898. So we're now here at 1910, now 1912. And we're looking at this whole thing. It's done for reasons. Now, see, they cannot steal, at that time, they could not steal elections. So they stole them by other candidates running against their own guy or other guy. But now listen to me. There was money given to Taft, who ran for office. There was money given also to Theodore Roosevelt, All of them were bankers who gave all the money to these guys who are running for office. 3 people. And a nobody named Woodrow Wilson wins it. And if you begin to realize simply is that as Mr. Wilson later on in his life realizes that he's made a huge mistake. In fact, he says, I've actually destroyed my country by following Colonel Mandel House. And how Mr. House was clever in persuading Mr. Wilson to do all these things, even though Wilson trusts this man completely and then uses noggin up here to say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. It doesn't work out. No, it was to do with his ego. You see, you will be given this such and such. And I'm going on elaborating here, but I don't want to keep it too long. But the point simply is that these things don't happen by accident. They just don't. And so I just wanted to share that. We'll do maybe tomorrow night, maybe a chapter or 2 also of this book. We'll go the Aldrich Plan. Some of the key people here that are involved are gigantic. There are people who are trying to fight this whole deal. There's a guy, a particular attorney that we'll probably discuss in the next tomorrow night. That is from Cleveland, Congressman Lindbergh. This is Lindbergh, the famous aviator son. That is Carl. Can't think of his name. Anyway, Lindbergh was the one who flew to single by himself to Europe, to England. And what's interesting about this whole thing is that his father was a congressman, and he fought against this. And it's also interesting as you go on in this book. It's just incredible what happens. Is that his father's place is destroyed because he opposed this. There were people who had already didn't want him to create more problems. And Congressman Lindbergh didn't secede. And later on, his son would run for office, and he was actually running for president. That's what it was. He was running for president, and they knew that he was going to win, and they had to do something. And so, with Franklin Roosevelt being running against him, he had a good chance of throwing Franklin Roosevelt out. And so, what they did was simply is they kidnapped his child, and they killed his child, and it broke Lindbergh's, that is the aviator's, heart, that he no longer had desire to quote unquote run for office. He did run an organization called American First to oppose the Second World War, but they basically, what can you say? When someone loses their child, it's been done on purpose. It was done on purpose to keep him out of the president, to keep him out of the office of being the president of the United States. Most people don't know this. In fact, 99.999% of the people don't understand what happens sometimes. Why do candidates step out of the whole deal? Think about Paul Wellstone, who was killed in a plane accident. But it wasn't an accident, folks. He has already begun to move against, this is back in the 80s, opposing certain, becoming the opposition of certain things. And he's becoming pretty loud about it. And someone dealt with that. They got rid of him. That's how big this whole operation is. This is how they completely, people are unaware that there is a sinister force, and I mean S-I-N, sinister force that is determined to have world government. And that's what's going on. And they're trying to destroy, they're trying to cause all kinds of harm to people. And what they want is to destroy humanity because they hate humanity. They hate humanity. And there are people are speaking out of this. We're seeing it it's gonna even become more and more prevalent, folks. Is that it can no longer. It's like coming in view, so to speak. If you remember the Romulans in the starship Star Trek, you remember they had a certain vehicle that would cloak itself, but in order for it to cloak or work, it had to, before it shot its supposedly weapon at the Enterprise, it had to come visible. It had to come visible in order for it to be able to shoot a weapon towards the Enterprise. And that's what I think is happening right now. It's going to come out visible, and people will see, if they're paying attention, what is really going on here. You see. And it's paramount that we speak out and say, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And no is the only word. You can no longer consent to what's going on anymore, folks. You got to say no. Because human life is at stake now. This is it. This is the bottom line. All life on this planet is in danger, you see. And I'm being very clear here, folks. You need to be aware of that. And that's what I mean simply is that it's going to come out of the veil. It's going to such and such, say, oh my God, what is this? And it will reveal itself. And people need to be vigilant. They need to say no. All this stuff that's going on is in our face now. In our face. Everywhere. And you got to say no. Saying you can no longer look to your neighbor or whatever. You're going to have to stand on your own. That's why I played this song, Stand or Fall, because simply is, if you do not stand against evil, all of humanity is going to fall, folks. That's it right now. We know that's what's taking place right now. And it's imperative that you understand these things, that we are at a dangerous end of all life on this planet. And it's pertinent you actually say no and make others aware, no matter the consequences. There might be people simply refuse, they don't want to hear anything about it. So what? It's no longer. All this programming from Tavistock is all about, is to destroy those who will stand against evil. And we're dealing with evil. Satanic system to destroy all mankind. And it's a multi weapon, so to speak, on all fronts. If you would think about it simply, is that it's like the Indians, except we're not the Indians, but the cowboys in the Westerns, they'll get in a circle, a wagon. The problem simply is all enemy forces are coming from the right, left, everywhere, attacking humanity in all aspects, psychologically, sociologically, educationally, everything, to destroy man. And we're here for that reason. Some of us are here. So, again, I just wanted to share this with you tonight. We'll go on to the next chapter, and this is well worth the money to buy it. I saw a couple copies that were $25. It may be dated back in the 1990s, but it's still prevalent, still important, because there's still key people here. You can gradually put the pieces together and say, wait a minute, what is going on here? And he has loads of the bibliography in here where he got the information from, and he also points out the key people who are involved in this whole fiasco, and those who have been involved in it even afterwards, you see. So I appreciate your attention tonight. And again, if you have any questions, and it's good to see you, Mr. Bankowski. I hope I pronounced your name, Kazimierz. Thank you for your time, Brent. You're welcome. Thank you for listening. I wish you a good night. You take care. Thank you.